The dress hung like a ghost in the mirror's reflection, silk cool against her fingertips. It shimmered under the warm light of the candles, a sea of white, a symbol of new beginnings, or perhaps endings. She wasn't sure anymore. Tomorrow was her wedding day. Tomorrow she would be Mrs. Ilara Vladescu. Ilara. It had a fairy tale ring to it, like something whispered on the wind. But fairy tales were for children, and Ilara, she was about to step into a world far more complicated than any storybook. Her fiancé, Lucien, was everything she ever wanted. Handsome, with eyes that held the grey of a stormy sky. He was wealthy, a scion of an old respected family from a distant land, a land of towering mountains and ancient forests. Transylvania, he called it. The word sent a shiver down her spine, a thrill of something unknown. He told her stories of his home, of the quaint mountaintop villages, of his family's castle overlooking it all. He had painted a picture so vivid in her mind that she could almost feel the crisp mountain air on her skin. But there were things he didn't speak of, shadows that lurked behind his eyes. His family, for instance. He seldom mentioned them. He had spoken of his mother, a frail woman with a heart of gold, and his father, a stern but loving patriarch. But there were no siblings, no aunts or uncles, no mention of anyone else who inhabited that grand, lonely castle. And his business, the source of his considerable wealth, remained a mystery. Whenever she pressed him, he would just smile that charming smile and change the subject. He had proposed on a moonlit night, the silver light bathing her face as he slipped the ring on her finger, a sapphire big as a robin's egg and just as blue as his eyes. She had said yes without hesitation. She loved him, of that she was sure, but there was a part of her, a small insistent voice at the back of her mind that whispered warnings, a sense of foreboding she couldn't shake off. The wedding was to be a grand affair, held at his insistence, not in her hometown but in a secluded castle in the Scottish Highlands. It was a place eerily similar to his descriptions of his own home, shrouded in mist and mystery. He had assured her it was for their privacy, for a chance to escape the prying eyes of the world and begin their life together in peace. But the isolation, the lack of familiar faces only served to amplify the unease gnawing at her. The wedding ceremony was a blur. She remembered the weight of the dress, the scent of lilies, the murmur of prayers in a language she didn't understand, and Lucien standing at the altar. But he seemed different somehow. Distant, his smile strained, his eyes holding a haunted look she had never seen before. He barely spoke during the ceremony, his responses clipped and formal. When he finally took her hand, his touch was cold, sending a tremor through her. The celebration after was even stranger. Lucien was a shadow, flitting through the crowd, his laughter hollow. He hardly touched his food, only drinking glass after glass of dark, potent wine. When she finally managed to corner him, his face was pale, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Lucien," she whispered, placing a hand on his arm. "What is it? What's wrong?" He flinched at her touch, his eyes wide with a strange mixture of fear and desperation. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Then he simply shook his head and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the crowded room. Later that night, as she sat alone in their wedding chamber, the truth came out. He stumbled in, reeking of alcohol, his eyes bloodshot. He stood before her, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight, and began to speak, his voice a choked whisper. "Ilara," he began, the name a foreign word on his lips. "There's something you need to know, something I should have told you before." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm not Lucien," he finally confessed, his voice barely a murmur. "I'm his brother, André." The truth hit her like a physical blow. The strange behavior, the haunted look in his eyes, it all made sense now. André, Lucien's twin brother, a person she had never even known existed. He explained everything, his words tumbling over each other in his haste. Lucien was gone, vanished without a trace just days before the wedding. Their family was in turmoil, the authorities baffled. They had found no note, no sign of a struggle, no indication of where he might have gone or why. The wedding, André explained, had to go on. To call it off would be to invite scandal, to shame the family name. And so he had stepped into his brother's shoes, forced to play a role he was never meant for. He had hoped against hope that Lucien would resurface, that he would somehow understand, forgive him. But as the days turned into weeks, his hope dwindled. He was trapped, living a lie, bound by duty and fear. Ilara, to her surprise, didn't scream, didn't lash out. She listened to his story, her mind struggling to process this sudden, unbelievable turn of events. The man she had married, the man she thought she knew, was an imposter. And yet, as she looked at Andrei, at the genuine fear and regret in his eyes, she felt a surge of sympathy. He was a victim in all of this, just as she was. Together, they decided to find Lucian. They traveled to Transylvania, to the Vladescu ancestral home. The castle, perched precariously on a mountaintop, was just as imposing as Lucian had described. They searched for clues, poring over Lucian's belongings, interviewing the few servants who worked there, but found nothing. Days turned into weeks, their initial suspicion and anger giving way to a quiet desperation. Ilara found herself drawn to Andrei, to his quiet strength, his unwavering determination to find his brother. He, in turn, confided in her, sharing his fears, his hopes, his guilt. They explored the surrounding forests and mountains, following rumors and whispers, each dead end deepening their despair. Yet with every passing day, an unsettling feeling began to grow in Ilara's heart. She found herself looking at Andrei, truly seeing him not as a substitute for his brother, but as a man in his own right. His quiet demeanor, so different from Lucian's boisterous charm, was oddly comforting. His dry wit, often hidden beneath a veil of sadness, made her smile. One evening, after a fruitless search, they found themselves on a hill overlooking the village. The sun was setting, bathing the valley in hues of orange and purple. "What if we never find him?" Ilara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Andrei turned to her, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "We have to," he said, his voice firm. "For him, for us!" And in that moment their hands brushed, sending a jolt of something unexpected through her. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A villager, an old woman with eyes as old as the mountains themselves, approached them. She spoke of an abandoned monastery, hidden deep in the forest, a place of dark legends and forgotten rituals. She claimed to have seen Lucian or someone who looked like him heading in that direction weeks ago. Hope, long dormant, flickered back to life. Andrei immediately set out for the monastery, Ilara by his side. The journey was treacherous, the forest thick and unforgiving, but they pressed on, driven by a shared purpose. As they neared their destination, the forest grew quiet, the air thick with an oppressive silence. They found the monastery in ruins, its crumbling walls cloaked in shadow. As they stepped inside, a cold wind slammed the door shut behind them. Ilara whirled around, heart pounding. "Andrei?" she called out, her voice echoing in the eerie silence. There was no reply. She was alone. Panic welled up inside her, threatening to consume her. She called out again, her voice cracking. "Andrei, where are you?" Then she heard it, a low chuckle coming from the far end of the hall. It was followed by a voice, smooth and familiar, sending chills down her spine. "Looking for your husband, Ilara?" The voice slithered through the darkness, dripping with malice. "You're in the wrong place. He's gone. Gone for good." The shadows shifted, resolving into a figure tall and imposing. He stepped into a sliver of moonlight, his face coming into focus. It was Andrei. But his eyes, once filled with warmth and concern, were cold, almost reptilian, and his lips were stretched into a cruel, triumphant smile.